It is the Guatemala Life and Culture podcast. Today is episode number 7. We're going to be talking about immigration. So immigration is going to be a 2-part episode, and kind of the way we're going to go about this, first of all, disclaimer, neither Don nor I are immigration attorneys. No. And what we're going to be talking about is just from our experience and being around the families, being around the community for a long time. Also, being there as families talk to their immigration attorneys, working with immigration attorneys, et cetera. So we're going to be talking more in generalities in these episodes. We're not going to get into the super specifics of anything because immigration, it does change. This is being recorded in 2024, end of 2024. So just kind of have that for context as well. But
good point.
Yeah. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
So immigration, definitely a hot topic in not only our nation, but the world. We hear a lot about refugees and just the pros and cons that immigration has. But one of the quotes I really like to kind of kick off our immigration talk is a quote that says, "A label might refer to what a person did, but it's not who they are." And I think that's important to remember for anything in life.
Absolutely.
I mean, you could be labeled an alcoholic or an illegal alien or a bad-tempered person, but in the end, that's not who you are. And that's important to keep in mind as we go through this.
For sure.
All right, important terms. So these are going to be terms that we hear a lot in the news. And I think that several of these are greatly misunderstood in what they actually mean. And a little bit of this might be dry, but it is very important. But the first one is immigrant. What does immigrant mean? Well, it's a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. Simple enough.
Yes.
Okay. Now, refugee. This is one that I think people might get a little confused over, but a refugee is defined as someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. And then these are the things that in order to qualify as a refugee, you have to meet one of these things to qualify as a refugee. And I want you to think about our Guatemalan families, you listeners or people watching, whenever I go through these and see how many of these they might fall into. So a refugee has to have a well-founded fear for, one, persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group.
So fear of one of these many things.
Correct.
Any one of these things. Yeah.
So I think when going back to our history episode when we talked about the genocide and the war that these families lived through and kind of what is continuing to happen in Guatemala, it's very reasonable to say that because they're indigenous Mayan Indians, they are being persecuted due to race. Their Mayan indigenous beliefs could be persecuted because of religion. Nationality, maybe not so much, but political opinion, certainly. And the obvious one, a member of our particular social group. Yeah. So the next term is asylum seeker. And we hear asylum bantered about quite a bit in the news. And what an asylum seeker is someone whose request for sanctuary has yet to be processed. And here's a major difference between a refugee and an asylee. A refugee is someone who is still, they're fleeing their country for the reasons we mentioned. However, they are in what is known as a refugee camp, or they're registered, at least for the United States, through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and they're awaiting their turn to be placed in a very particular part of the United States, often where other individuals from their nation or religious group are located. So take Columbus, for example. There's a large Somali population. So if you are
refugees.
Correct.
Yes.
So if you're a Somali refugee, you still might technically be in Somalia, or you might be in a neighboring country of Somalia,
right,
waiting for the Office of Refugee Resettlement to place you in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's your refugee and your refugee community. Mm-hmm. Whenever they arrive in the States, they have a caseworker. They have someone to help them find a job, help find them housing, and they're kind of followed up with. Mm-hmm. How that's different from an asylee or an asylum seeker is that is someone who shows up in the country mm-hmm. and they're like, I need asylum.
Yeah.
And that would be our southern border. So someone from Guatemala crosses the border and immigration captures them. They're like, I cannot return to mm-hmm. Guatemala or my host country for fear of my life. Mm-hmm. That would be someone who's declaring asylum. And per our laws currently, mm-hmm. the U.S. can't send that person back. Although there's been some back and forth with that. Correct. And some of that happening.
Yeah.
But that's the important thing to remember is refugee is someone who's waiting to be placed in the United States, and asylee is someone who's shown up and says, I can't go back.
Mm-hmm. So could also, just to clarify these terms, a refugee could also be could a refugee be someone who is currently living in the States in a refugee settlement? Or are they considered at that point an asylum seeker as a refugee? Because I see the confusion, or sometimes they're used simultaneously. Because to me, when I think of refugee and refugee camp settlement, I think of, yes, a war or an act of war where maybe the U.S. military comes in and kind of brings this group of people, like assists them in their departure of said violent, dangerous place. Mm-hmm. So they're very much, might not even have the choice of being a refugee, more so, it seems. Whereas an asylum seeker they're taking the initiative for their own rescue. Does that make
sense? I think I know where you're going with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, certainly an asylee is someone who's taking it upon themselves. Mm-hmm. Like, there's no one that's tangibly forcing them out for the purpose of their own safety.
Correct.
Or anything like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because those, I think, there are certain geographical places that come to our mind, like when you say refugee, Somalia, like you said, or I think Syria, places like that who have then countries like Greece have received, and other countries, many, many refugees in abundance because of civil war or unrest in those areas of the world. I think that's what our minds think of first to distinguish the difference, maybe. Yeah. That's
a good example maybe to use is, so say take someone from Syria and say they flee into Turkey, mm-hmm. The northern border of Syria. They're a refugee, but then if they're saying, I don't want to go back, or I want to stay in your country, you Turkey, mm-hmm. then that's seeking asylum. So then they are an asylum seeker.
Yes.
But they're already in that country when they do that.
Yeah.
But
that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
And you're right, this is all very complicated, right? Because then the other example to kind of show an example of the other side of it is, so Burma, a genocide going on in Burma, mm-hmm. those groups of people, like take the Karen tribe, they flee across the border into Thailand, and there are numerous Burmese refugee mm-hmm. camps that are in Thailand.
Right.
And that is where they're working and hoping to eventually be sent to England or Germany or the United States. But they are refugees at that point. But they're not asylees.
Mm-hmm. They're not seeking permanent residence. Well, it depends, I guess. I don't.
It depends.
I shouldn't say too much.
We won't get that too far into the weeds.
But this is exactly the way the conversation goes, because there's so many branches of, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? And what category does it come under? That's very complex sometimes.
That is a perfect point.
Yeah.
That is why when you hear people talking about immigration, even major news networks, you really can't take a blanket approach.
No,
it really is on a case-by-case basis, and it would be easy to tell a story, good or bad, about a group of people based off of some of the information we're talking about here. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to talk about. But that's not the reality for the family. So just a word of caution for everyone out there. Just really take the time to try and do that background research for every single case. Basically, if you're going to have a strong opinion about something, make sure you're educated about it. If not, just say you don't know, right?
Good rule of thumb for anything. Yeah.
So to continue here, undocumented, that's another big one. Undocumented does not mean that the individuals have zero paperwork saying who they are. I think that's what some people think when they hear undocumented, that, oh, we have no idea who this person is. Yeah. Well, undocumented means they don't have the proper authorization and U.S. documents to be here or to enter our country. They still, in the case of our Guatemalan families who do come to our country in this manner as an asylum seeker or refugee, they do have birth certificates. They have Guatemalan passports or ID cards, and we'll see some examples of that here in a little bit. But we know who they are. Yes. Are there the few out there that we have no idea? Yes, that is out there too. But the majority, mass majority, they do have some sort of documentation. So when you hear undocumented, it means that they just don't have a U.S. form of ID. And I'm not going to get too much into amnesty, but amnesty essentially means it includes the federal government forgiving individuals for using that false documentation. So some, once they come here, do get their hands on false IDs, use different names, and social security numbers and driver's license, etc., in order to gain employment. So amnesty would mean that is all forgiven, and now that will not be held against them, and they can continue working, quote unquote, above the line. Right? So permanent residents. So permanent residents are given what's known as a green card. So that is one of the things that I think is really misunderstood. And if you're watching us here today, you're going to see on the screen some examples of these IDs. And if you're listening, again, a link to the video will be posted below to where you'll be able to check these out when you're able to do so. But the top left, green card, permanent resident,
Top
gone.
Left.
Does green card equal citizenship?
No, it does not.
It does not, right? And that's a big misunderstanding when people say, oh, you got your green card.
I thought you were going to ask me what color is the card. And I was going to say it has some green in it, but it's not. But isn't there one that's a green card that's not, it doesn't even have anything to do with
really
the color? Like,
green
where did that term come from?
Yeah. So I'm kind of colorblind, so I'm glad that you explained that.
You are. It looks more teal to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not like straight up green.
No. Do you know the origin of green card? Do we know that?
I don't.
Why? Like, does green just mean go? So, yeah.
That's a great theory.
Maybe. I don't know. But it does not mean no citizen. No.
Correct. And we'll talk about the differences of what a permanent resident can and can't do compared to a U.S. citizen here in a second. But we also have some other IDs that we're showing here. We have the DPI card from Guatemala. We have the consulate card. We have a Guatemalan passport. So again, these are things that, for those of you interacting with the community, these are forms of identification that they might be showing you to prove who they are. And it goes back to, these are things that they brought with them from Guatemala. And we actually do have a Guatemalan consulate. The closest active one is in Chicago. So they can get their passports renewed and other documentation. But we also have a small one in Columbus that it's still trying to get its feet off the ground.
Yes, I haven't had too many experiences where I've heard of a lot of people going to Columbus. Like, it hasn't. People still go to Chicago.
Yeah.
Because that's
the for sure.
That's the one that's set up. Yeah.
All right. So what's the difference? So we hear people coming on a visa, right? And there's a lot of different visas. We hear permanent resident, and then we have citizen. So what can a permanent resident do, or someone with a green card? Can they travel freely in the U.S.? Yes.
Yes.
It's lifelong valid. Unless you do something terribly wrong, then it could be revoked, but it's lifelong. Can you get Medicare and get benefits if you have a green card? Yes, after you've had it for 5 years.
5 years. Mm-hmm.
Can you get U.S. citizenship? Yes, after 3 to 5 years. So when we hear someone say, oh, become a U.S. citizen, well, first, they have to be able to become a permanent resident, which that's a process in and of itself. Yeah. Then you have to have that for 3 to 5 years before you can begin applying to be a U.S. citizen and take the tests. Do they have the right to vote? Not entirely. It's limited.
It says, I'm cheating off of cheat as well. Limited is maybe someday or for certain things.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Sometimes a social security card for work only. Some people might see that. That is given by the government for the individual to be able to work legally with a social security number, but that is limited to work only. It doesn't allow them to get any of the other benefits from that social security card. They're able to work and they're able to study in the U.S. up to 80% cheaper as opposed to being someone who is, say, a foreign exchange student. So someone with a visa is not able to, they're able to travel freely in the U.S., but it's for a certain amount of time. It's usually good for however long, but it's typically months, not more than a year.
3 months, is the typical.
Yeah, before you'd maybe have to reapply.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, side note, I was in Chile and overstayed my visa one time. I didn't overstay it. I didn't renew it in time. So instead of just being able to go and renew it once, I had to make various visits to an office and go back and sign every week for a couple of weeks. So that was the cost of travel, basically just a couple hours on a bus but yeah, that was just a naive, ignorant thing that I missed. But yeah, it is a limited time. Yeah, in many countries or every country probably.
Yeah. And that's another way that people can become undocumented is their visa expires. Yep. And so they're here, they had that identification, but it's no longer valid. So therefore they are now undocumented. So you can see just from your experience, for you. Yeah.
I mean, they could have made me leave.
Ended up in that situation. So
yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there should be warnings of, this is getting close, but it's not, it's just different when you don't have to think about that, just the thought of even a trip, I'm going to stay for a while. You don't really think of those parameters of, because you're from a different place, that doesn't give you long-term access. It just for us, for anybody,
that
it just doesn't.
Entitlement doesn't exist anywhere else, does it? So people with a visa, they are not allowed to vote. They're limited to work, so it depends on their type of visa. And they can study in the States, but it's that foreign student fee. So just to put into context for our local community, so we have some students who were born to immigrant parents.
Yes.
In Guatemala. And then they moved with their parents to the States when they were, say, 2 years old, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. And then when they get here, they eventually go into maybe Head Start, preschool, then go into kindergarten at a local school district. They go their entire life going through our school system. They graduate high school, one even with honors.
Yep.
But when they graduate, they still cannot go to school without paying the foreign exchange student. Not exchange student.
Not exchange, but as someone who was not born here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so think about that. You lived your whole life, your entire school life in Ohio, and then if you want to go to a school, you might have to pay those out of out-of-state fees.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's crazy because for a child of 2 or 4 years, whatever, a young child, like, and all of that upbringing, you mentioned the school, like, they're completely acclimated as an American.
They might not even be able to speak their Spanish very well.
Home life, right. Home life, they definitely have a lot of their parents are still preserving their language and culture very well as Guatemalans do. But they probably are speaking English first if that's when they're really formulating language. So the definition of, being a citizen is an interesting concept in itself, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just goes to show you the system. It is broken, whatever side of the immigration debate you're on. It's things like that where it shows it needs to be fixed, because how is that helping that individual who, for all intents and purposes, is just as local and as much of a citizen as
brought
anyone
up
else,
here.
but the label
right
changes that. So, all right. So we're going to move into kind of we're going to use the fake name. This is not a real individual. So this is going to be a general kind of story of someone who comes to the United States with using a coyote. So we're not going to be talking about someone who comes with a visa and applies. We'll talk about that process.
We will, yes.
But we're going to use the name Julio.
Okay.
Julio has a wife and 3 kids in Guatemala.
Okay.
Julio lived through the end of the Civil War. He doesn't have... He wants to build his own home back up, but right now he only has his... trying to buy that land back.
In Guatemala. Yeah. So he's coming to the U.S. to work.
Yeah, living $2 a day. We'll get there.
Yes.
And so he decides that, I have some cousins in the States. I have cousins in Ohio. And I see on social media, because yes, social media is everywhere, even in the developing world. They seem to be doing okay. Like, they're making anywhere from, $8 to $15 an hour. That's awesome. Imagine that, living off of $2 a day, and you're thinking of 15,
right,
or less, a little bit less dollars an hour. That's insane. And again, we're going back to survival mode. So Julio sees that and he's like, okay, yeah, I'd love to maybe go do that. I want to be back here with my family in Guatemala. I want to build my own house, but there's no way I'm going to make that dream possible without being able to get some money somehow. So he decides to go to the States. And someone might ask, so he needs to do it the right way. So the right way...
People would say, sorry to interrupt, but I want them to come here for a better life, but I just wish they would do it the right way, as there is a, like, seemingly an option to do it the right way. Unfortunately, it's very, very hard.
Yes.
Very, very challenging. Yeah.
And that's where we're going to take a little walk in empathy with Julio. So whether you agree with the decisions that Julio is about to make or not, just try to see the logic and the empathy in it. This is what we're going to walk through. Yeah. So the right way would be, or the quote unquote right way would be, to try and apply for a visa. So when you apply for a visa, Julio lives in Ahuacatan, so he would have to travel the 4.5 to 5 hours to Guatemala City to the U.S. Embassy. And in order to get there, he might have to take time away from the work that he was doing. He would have to pay for a ride. And that 4.5 to 5 hours is kind of, that could be way longer depending on how you're traveling and what, how long you're having to wait for different transportations. It's obviously there's not transportation like we have here in the States, right? You're going from little vehicle or chicken bus to chicken bus type of a thing. So when he gets there, he would have to apply for an appointment. But before that appointment took place, he would also have to apply online for a visa. And he would have to choose between numerous different visas. I mean, we're talking more than 20 different types of visas. You would have to apply online. You would have to pay an upfront application fee, which when I helped someone, this would have been 10 years ago now. So it was $200 application fee back then. I don't know what it would be today, but I can't imagine it's any cheaper.
Probably not. Yeah.
So think about Julio, who's making $2 a day, who might not be literate because he wasn't able to go to school due to the war and due to the situation that they were in. All he's thinking about is needing to make money and getting to the States. So even if this was available to him, reality is he's not going to be able to do this because not only do you have to go on, choose which application or visa you're applying for, pay for it up front, go to the Guatemala city, do the appointment, and during that, they're going to ask you questions because they want to make sure that you're someone who's going to return to Guatemala at the end of your visa stay. Well, then you have to have references in the States. You have to have a certain amount in your bank account to do that. So all these sorts of things are stacking up against deciding to go.
So like strike one, what if you don't have a bank account or any connection? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just like multiple of those options. Yeah. What if you miss one of them? It could be, well, you just didn't pass.
For sure. Yeah. And so to go back to my experience, we were applying for a student visa. So this individual's family was in the States and the girl, she was brought to the States when she was 5, attended the local school district until she was in 6th grade. Then they moved back as a family to Guatemala. She was the oldest of 4 kids, and she was the only one that was born in Guatemala. The 3 younger ones were born in the States. So them being born in the States, they're citizens. They have all the freedoms that a citizen has. Well, they wanted this girl to be able to study again back in the United States and complete her education here. So applied for a student visa. That's where it took $200 up front, helped the family navigate the application. Obviously, there were references here that knew the family. I was actually in Guatemala when we went to the embassy appointment, and there was 3 sessions that day for visas. Okay. Each session had 200 people. So 600 people just that day was applying for a visa to get in the United States. So think about it from that perspective. From the United States perspective, you had 600 people on one day in one country. Now, think about all the other countries in the world. Yeah. Think about all the other days of the year. That's a lot of people. So that is partly why that threshold is so high. And so long story short, she didn't get it. It was denied. So Julio decides that's not going to work. So he decides to go with a coyote because he heard from his cousin that, hey, I went up with this person. Here's their number. They'll get you to the States. Then you can start working. It's great. So Guatemalans who do come with coyotes, typically they pay the coyote anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000. And then you're thinking like, okay, so if they couldn't pay the upfront application fee.
Exactly, yes. How can they pay this?
Right. Well, what the coyotes do is maybe they'll take a little money up front, but they're like, you can pay us back in payments, or you can pay us back later. Yeah. And if you're thinking about going from making $2 a day to $8 to $15 an hour, working 8 to 10, 12 hours a day, you're thinking, okay, I'll be able to pay that back pretty quick. Then I can start using the money to build my house and provide for my kids a better future.
And oftentimes, if you can't, like say you don't have connection or communication with this coyote for a while, like they just are there to guide you along your journey and then they leave, right? Yep. The families who are receiving someone will pay the coyote fee. So then that person is indebted to whoever they came to live with. So I hear that quite often. Well, I have to work. I have to start working because I have to pay off my travel fees for when I came here. I owe my uncle or my brother-in-law or whoever who was able to front that.
Absolutely.
So there's no connection with like sending money to whoever, wherever, I mean, that seems shady, but so often those people are the ones who will front your cost, and then you're indebted to them, which
cause some hard family dynamics.
Might seem like, oh, well, that's nice, I just have to pay my cousin, but yes, it could change things. And unfortunately, sometimes people's words of, well, you can pay this whenever, then when they start to feel the pressure of, I got to pay my kids' medical fees or something, they start to ask for the money sooner than later.
And there's no legally binding like documents that anybody signs, so it's purely it can get kind of ugly there. But so coyotes could be good people or bad people. Yes. By good people, bad people, I mean harmful people or not harmful people. And so they might actually take pretty good care of the people that they're bringing forth. But then you also have the ones that do take advantage, and it can get pretty dangerous. One of the more dangerous parts of the journey is, going through Chiapas, southern Mexico, and then also just obviously dealing with the elements wherever you are, northern Mexico, southern U.S. But
it's from what I've heard also that the less people who would do harm along the way are the coyotes themselves. It would be more when they're staying overnight somewhere, and maybe there's just so many people, one guide can't be...
It's like a shepherd and the sheep, right?
Yeah, be vigilant of them all at the same time, and that's where locals or whoever knows that there's this vulnerable group of young people or whoever, a vulnerable group, that's where they're taken advantage of or abused or worse.
Yeah, and so an example of that, when I was doing my advocacy stuff, there was a father who was here, and he had his 5-year-old son, but his pregnant wife and 7 or 8-year-old daughter was still in Guatemala, and they were coming up with a coyote, and he, was telling me about it, and a certain amount of time later, he calls me, and he's a little frantic, and he's saying like, hey, someone called me from a Mexican number. They said that they're with my wife and they need $2,000 or they're going to rape my wife. And I'm like, oh, okay. It's one of those bizarre things that you don't think like you're ever going to actually be, a part of in any sort of way. And obviously there wasn't much we could do, but we did contact we had an FBI representative that we had worked with, and contacted her and said like, hey, is there anything that can be done? And contacted the Guatemalan embassy in Mexico City, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, there wasn't anything you could do. There wasn't anything obviously the FBI could do because they weren't U.S. citizens. That wasn't anything to do with the United States. But the Guatemalan government wasn't going to do anything either, nor was the Mexican. So going back to your point of family members, he then went to family members and friends and was asking for money, and somehow he ended up getting the $2,000 and sent this to them. I don't know how. But then another week goes by, and then he gets another call. And he calls me again. He says, hey, they're at the border. And this just goes to show you. He said, the U.S. immigration wants $5,000 and then they'll let her cross. I said, that is not U.S. immigration. That is not the way that they operate. That is 100% not them. But he was in survival mode. He was worried. It didn't matter what I said. Right. It wasn't going to matter. Right. So to make a longer story short, he ended up finding a way to pay that. So now he's $7,000 more in debt on top of what they paid to get here. And fast forward, they ended up losing the kids in U.S. to
losing custody of
the kids because kids weren't going to school. They weren't able to pay their rent. They were going to be evicted and all these sorts of things that the school wasn't aware of. of the history of why they weren't paying their rent. But it just put it all in a whole bad situation.
Right.
And that's where it ends up.
Yeah.
And again, that's not every family you're going to come across, but that's just one specific example. Sure. It does happen. Mm-hmm. And so with that, there are also advertisements in these towns in the aldeas that are advertising like, hey, you want a better life? We'll take you up there. You know, they're coyote advertisements and you call the number and then boom, your journey starts. So that's what Julio does.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And he comes up and now he's in debt, but he's made it to the border. And we'll pick up his story here in a little bit. But one of the other things, or terms that we hear is unaccompanied minors. And this is big for our schools.
Yes.
Don, what is an unaccompanied minor?
Wow, really put me on the spot because I don't know the official definition other than an unaccompanied minor would be a migrant or asylum seeker, to put it specifically, or someone who is coming to the U.S. who is on their own under the age of 18, who is not have a legal guardian with them.
Correct. And that's the key term, with them. Yes. So they might make
not
the journey
physically with them. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Make the journey alone, but they're planning to join a family member.
Yes.
Whether it's an aunt, uncle, brother, sister, or even a mom or a dad once they arrive in the States.
Right.
And for our county, Tuscarawas County, I'll just go from 2017 up through 2021. I don't have the stats for the recent years, but in 2017, we had 75 unaccompanied minors placed in our county alone. 2018, there were 66. 2019, 97. 2021, 93.
Yeah, I have a feeling that it only has gotten bigger in those 22, 23. We did say we're in 2024 right now. 22 and 23 must be higher than that, based on what I saw, yes, in the school system, that there was an influx, if you will, at certain parts of the year. Not always at the same time, like not always at the start of the school year, sometimes in January, sometimes in April. Yeah, it just depends. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're kind of winding down this half of our immigration talk. And just to kind of close it out, so what is the approval rate of these people that are applying for asylum? Well, it's not very high at all. So from the Justice Department, in 2018, there was about 160,000 people that applied for asylum.
Yeah.
Out of that 160,000, under 20,000 were granted asylum. And we'll talk about in the next episode, as you're waiting for your case to be heard, you're allowed to be in the States. So with that, thank you again for joining us for this Guatemala Life and Culture episode. Stay tuned for episode 2 of Immigration.